So first, I want to tell you who I am. My name is Leah Esslinger. I am the moderator of this panel. Do you guys all hear me okay? Great. I'm moderating this panel. I work at Virginia Humanities right now in communications. And I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of Virginia Humanities, the producer of the Virginia Festival of the Book. I would like to remind you all right now to make sure your cell phones are silent. But I would also like to invite you to please tweet about this event silently. And when you do tweet about this event, please use the hashtag VABookFest or hashtag VABook 2022. You guys all look like you have very lively social media
accounts.
Lives. So, just thank you again for coming out, and I want to thank everyone who may be watching at home. And I do just want to quickly mention that we have a bookseller right outside selling all of the books that you see featured here. And that's M. Revac. You can find him online at mrevac.com. So I just want to thank him for coming out as well. Okay, so the festival is free of charge. I'd like to remind you that it is not free of cost. So if you are able to, please consider supporting festival programming with a donation by visiting vabook.org. Your support ensures that we may sustain the festival for many more years. After this is over, please consider evaluating the program, and you can do that by either going online to vabook.org/feedback, or you can just, if you have your festival programs, you can just take a picture of the QR code on the back of that program. You can just simply open your phone's camera app, hold it over the QR code, and then select the link that pops up. Okay, so COVID precautions. In order to keep all in our community as safe as possible, please keep your masks on at this event. We speakers have just shown negative test results before removing our masks, so we do have our masks removed just to make sure that you can all hear us clearly. Okay, as I mentioned, there are books for sale right outside of this event. For those viewing at home, you can go to the event page at vabook.org. And after this, it'll be on vabook.org/watch, and you can click on the titles, and they will take you immediately to the book for purchase. And also, after this event, you can hang around. The authors will be available for signing. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the program again. We are at Entangled Tales, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce each one of the authors next to me today. I have John Copenhaver. He is author of The Savage Kind. He won the McAvity Award for Best First Mystery Novel and garnered Anthony, Strand Critics, Barry, and Lambda Literary Award nominations for his previous novel, Dodging and Burning. He lives in Richmond, Virginia with his husband, artist Jeffrey Paul. Next, we have Ellen Crosby. Ellen is the author of the Virginia Wine Country Mystery Series. So this is a part of a mystery series. She also has her newest book, Bitter Roots. It publishes on April 5th. Today's book, The French Paradox, was one of the Strand Magazine's top mysteries of 2021. Next up in 2023, a third book in her Sophie Medina series. Ellen previously served as the Moscow correspondent for ABC Radio News. And then we have Tara Laskowski. She is the author of The Mother Next Door and a novelist and a short story writer. Her debut suspense novel, One Night Gone, won the Agatha Award, McAvity Award, and the Anthony Award, and was a finalist for the Simon & Schuster, Mary Higgins Clark, and Library of VA Literary Awards, Library of Virginia Literary Awards, I think. Okay, shoot. That was a mouthful. Hope I did okay.
You're great.
Great.
Okay. All right, now let's move into our program. So thank you all for coming and being a part of this. Okay. And so we're going to start right now with having each of the author give us just a little bit of an introduction to the work that we're here to discuss today. So maybe we'll start with you, John.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and having us. I love this festival. So The Savage Kind is a historical mystery set in 1948, Washington, D.C., and it centers around two teenage girls. One of those girls is new to Washington, D.C., and they are sort of friends that are a situation of opposites attracting. And they are both drawn to their sort of elegant and somewhat romantic vision of a high school English teacher, Miss Martins. And so they bond over this relationship with their teacher. I'm also an English teacher, so I know a little something about that. Anyway, of course, it being a mystery novel, a classmate of theirs winds up dead, and they have to partner with their teacher and uncover a lot of mysteries about themselves, and it really takes darker turns in terms of character development. I really can sort of have characterized it as my coming of age story for a femme fatale. So.
Whoa. Whoa. Me? Okay. I am the outlier in this group because this is The French Paradox is the 11th book in my series about a woman who owns a vineyard in Virginia. So if any of you know my previous books, as I kept writing this series, the thing that sort of really intrigued me with each book was history. And so there's a lot of history in my books, and I try to usually marry something historical with a contemporary plot. And so by the time I got to this book, I'd always known I wanted to write something about Jackie Kennedy, because Jackie Kennedy, if any of you know Middleburg, spent a lot of time in Middleburg. While her husband was president, they had a house there, and then in later days, towards the end of her life, in fact, shortly before she died, she used to go back to Middleburg to hunt and ride. So I wanted to write about Jackie, but I didn't quite know how to integrate her into the story. And I have a friend who is on the board of directors of the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, and she said, that's such a cool museum. And she said, have you ever thought about writing about the women artists who were as talented as the old master painters, but they never had the success because they were women. And she said, we call them the old mistresses. So I had this idea, it's like the old mistresses, Jackie, how am I going to do that? And then a friend of mine, Ann Ma, who is also a mystery author, wrote a story for the New York Times on Jackie Kennedy's junior year abroad in 1949, where she went to study art history. So I suddenly had my link, and basically the premise of the story is that when Jackie was in Paris in 1949 at the end of World War II, before these paintings were valuable, she found a couple of paintings by Marie Antoinette's portrait painter in a book stall in Paris. And she brings them home, and she's bequeathed them to a friend of hers who's going to be donating them to the National Museum of the Women in the Arts. And along the way, someone turns up dead, and so the story kind of goes from there.
So here's where I say I'm the outlier on the panel because I'm the only one reading contemporary histories. So I write mostly domestic suspense, no history involved really. So The Mother Next Door is my second novel, and it's sort of my homage to Halloween, which is my favorite holiday, and my birthday. And so the story takes place in Northern Virginia, in wealthy suburbs. There's a group of competitive moms, and they throw this crazy annual Halloween block party every year. And a new mom moves into the neighborhood, and so they're trying to kind of bring her into their clique. But she's got all these secrets in her past that she doesn't want them to find out about. And they've got all these secrets that they don't want anyone to find out about. And so as the kind of clock ticks down to this year's party, things start to happen where they think, maybe some of these secrets are coming out, and they're trying to figure out, I guess, how far they can go to keep them buried forever. So.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for that. Now, as you point out, all of these books have a lot of differences between them, but they had one similarity that I really noticed, and that was the strength of the setting. So I think that none of these stories work really well outside of the setting, and that's just really to say that the sense of place that you get is so strong. And so one of the questions that I have is just, when do you choose these settings? And maybe we could start with Ellen, because I do know that this is a series.
Well, actually, it was my editor in my literary agent when I was living in London. We had come home on home leave one summer, and my husband's French, and we have a friend who lives in Reston who was a really big Virginia wine fan. And if you're French and you're my husband, you do not put Virginia and wine together in the same sentence. And so our friend thought, well, we needed to see the vineyards. So he took us on this tour, and when I got back to London, it's August, it's cold, it's rainy, you're ready for winter, it's London. And I was talking about this idyllic summer day and the beauty of Virginia and these places we visited, and my agent said to me, that would be a great setting for a book. And I said, yeah, but I've lived in all these really interesting places overseas, and I've always wanted to write a book with an international setting. And she said, Ellen, you live in England. Virginia is a foreign setting. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of hard to argue with. So I said, all right, I will write one. And this is 11, and that's 12.
Thank you, Ellen. Maybe now we'll go to Tara.
So for me, setting is the first thing that I actually think of before I can write a book. So I need to see a place and kind of know what I'm going to do, and it needs to be creepy enough that I can make bad things happen inside of it. So for my first novel, I picked a beach town, and I wanted to write about the beach in the off-season, like when all the tourists go away, and how the town changes. For this one, I picked the suburbs because I find the suburbs extremely creepy, and I find moms very creepy sometimes. I am one, so I'm allowed to say that. And then when I had originally thought of the idea for this book, it was taking place in May around graduation time because the moms all have teenagers and they were graduating. And I thought it would be kind of cool to write about this, the pressures of graduation and getting into college and all that. But it wasn't atmospheric enough for me. And so I actually switched it to Halloween, and I was like, this is perfect, this is great. So I got to get into the fall and all of the things about Halloween that I love, which was great. But I also was writing it during the pandemic, and I think that it takes place on a cul-de-sac, and almost all of the scenes in the book take place on this street. And so it has this sort of insular, like kind of almost claustrophobic feel to it. And I think part of that is because I was reading it during the pandemic and home all the time, and we were all home. And so I think a lot of those feelings kind of got into the book too, which kind of makes it a little more of that atmospheric feeling, I think.
So both my novels are set in the 1940s. Dodging and Burning set in 1945, and in Virginia and somewhat D.C. And then, of course, Savage Kindness is entirely in D.C. in 1948. And clearly, you're 100% right. I mean, this time period fascinates me because the whole post-war period fascinates me, and it's what's going on socially during that time period. And we're moving to a very conservative time period in the history of the United States. And I think that I have two young teenage girls who are attracted to each other. So, they don't necessarily figure out who they are at this time. In this installment of the book, I have two others planned. But who are they going to be? What is the future for them? And to what degree is that future limited? And in the case of these very intelligent young women, they see a high school teacher that seems to sort of be emblematic of who they might be. Of course, it's a mystery, so there's a lot that seems to be true that isn't. But they're very much on a journey to figure out who they are and facing a lot of a time period that's going to be very limiting for them. They are also pretty adamant about becoming who they are. So those two things clashing. In the time period, in both cases, I have sort of this idea of a sort of limiting social space and time being sort of, and then throwing characters against it. And so I think that, and the telling sort of a mystery that kind of exposes that and digs it up a little bit. So yeah, it has, that post-war era is just fascinating to me. I think it continues to be.
Okay, so we're talking about atmosphere, and we're talking about transitional periods and the setting of these books. But they're as mysteries. One of the things that you have to do is you turn up the pressure on these characters, and so the strength of these settings, from the grittiness of 1940s DC, and even the pressures in the of these gilded estates for you, Ellen, and everything that people have to give up because of that, and of course, like Tara, those suburbs were so stifling. I wonder what role do they play in like turning up the pressures on these characters? Maybe this time, I think we started with Ellen last time. Let's start with Tara this time.
So to go back to the idea of like moms and competition, one of the things I was thinking about when I wrote this is the idea that women, especially moms, I think, have these pressures to, have it all. It's like you can have a job, you can raise your child, you can be a writer, you can, have other passions and interests, you can be sexy, you could, whatever. And you can't. I mean, and the pandemic, I think, really highlighted that for a lot of people. Like you are juggling all of these things and you're going to drop a lot of balls. And so I was thinking about that. And then I was also thinking about this idea of like, we're living in the social media age where, you take 763 selfies before you get the right angle and the right shadows to post it to look great that day. Or you post your vacation photos, and so you're scrolling through these feeds and you're seeing all of these wonderful things. And so there's this tension between like, we have to show that we are awesome and we are perfect and everything's great in our lives. And yet at the same time, like struggling to like stay afloat some days. And so I think that's where, the setting and these moms and this whole community, I think that's where the pressure really comes from in this book for me, because they are trying to put on this like perfect party and everything has to be perfect. And those pressures, in addition to like all of the mistakes that they've made that they can't admit to themselves even, that causes people to break. And for them, it really caused them to break, but hopefully that doesn't happen to most people. But yeah, so I think that's kind of where my book was going, to some degree, yeah.
Maybe we'll go to John next.
Sure. So my two, I guess, leads of the story, Judy and Philippa, I think in different ways are finding it very frustrating to live in this world that is not giving them a lot of options. And so Judy is sort of a rebel. She doesn't dress typical of the time period. She dressed more like a flapper. It's 1948. She does this on purpose. She has very sharp elbows and speaks her mind freely. And no one really likes her. She's very isolated for that reason. She also has a very, upsetting childhood story. She was adopted, but had spent many years in an orphanage. And so there's just a lot about her that is just not fitting in very obviously. Philippa's a little different because Philippa looks very typical and behaves in a very typical manner for the time period, but inside her, she's feeling very differently, both sort of in terms of same-sex attraction, but also I think it's more than just that. It's also about the desire to be to express herself freely, and a desire to be free. And so here's a time period that's saying, no, you can't. And so those two things, I think, really drive them. They do sort of take up a mystery to solve, which has a lot to do with them ultimately. But what's driving them underneath all that is their desire to be themselves in a time period that doesn't really want them to be that. And both of the teenage girls sort of deal with that differently. Judy throws it back at everyone. Philippa conforms. But, I think it gets complicated.
So let's dig into the protagonists a little bit more. Let's start with the role of the narrators.
Do you want me to talk?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's
Ellen,
okay.
no, please.
Okay. So Well, I read one time something that someone said that everyone's entitled to a private life, but living a secret life will get you in trouble. And I always thought that was a really interesting line. And so one of the things that another part of the story is that Lucy's grandfather, who is a recurring character, he's appeared in a couple of earlier books. He's French. He's a diplomat. He's actually based on my husband's late uncle, who I adored, who was a French diplomat who lived in Paris. He's coming over for this big birthday party that one of Jackie's best friends from the year in Paris is having, and she lives in Middleburg, and they were all friends together in Paris. But Lucy found out that her grandfather and Jackie Kennedy had an affair in 1949. And she found out when she read her grandmother's diaries, because her grandmother knew and her grandmother found out. So all these years later, it's been a secret, and the women in the family have known, but no one has known about it. So along with the paintings of Marie Antoinette, among Jackie's belongings that she left to her friend was a diary. And this woman's daughter is going to take the diary and pretty much blow it up and use it to sort of exploit Jackie's tie to the paintings and possibly bring in Lucy's grandfather. And I think that gets into like how much, especially in this era of social media. I mean, when I started working as a journalist, there was no social media, so you had to be very careful what you revealed about people. You had to spell their name right, but you couldn't reveal anything they didn't want. And so back in those days, Jackie and Lucy's grandfather communicated by letters. And can you just imagine today, does anybody still write love letters? It's like a love tweet, or one of those stories, and it disappears and everything. So I was really intrigued by old journals and letters where people don't ever expect those things to be made public, and how much are we entitled to our privacy versus our secrets.
Thank you. I just want to apologize again.
Oh,
I'm so
no.
sorry about that.
I was teasing you.
And this time I want to start with you, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to talk about the role of the narrator. And I'd like to start with you, Ellen, because in the other two books, the role of the narrator is they kind of pivot. There's two different narrators. In yours, though, I do think there's one main narrator, but there are other voices that help us tell the story through these letters that you're talking about in the diaries. And so I just wanted to pose to the question, but starting with you, how can you just tell us a little bit about how the narrator operates, narrator or narrators?
Well, I think writing in first person already imposes a certain set of constraints on the author, because you can only know things that Lucy knows, and you can't infer anything from, you can't say that he said this because he felt so-and-so, because she doesn't know that. And as it turns out, Tara's husband, Art Taylor, and I and a couple of other authors are in a critique group together, which we have met every single month for the past 11 years. We've never missed a meeting. And we've gone to
11
Zoom.
years?
Yeah, it has. I remember when you were expecting Dash.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. So POV, so point of view, is a big thing. And what we do is we bring work and we read. And we used to meet at John's house, and he now just moved to West Virginia. So and then we moved to Zoom when we all moved to Zoom, and Art hosts that through George Mason. So now we read. And we comment on each other's works. But one of the things that we all catch each other on is point of view. And you really have to stay in that person's head, because the minute you leave, you take the person out of the story. So staying in Lucy's head has been something that, I've always tried to be very aware of and very careful in what she can know. But it gets tricky, like how you advance the story where somebody's not omniscient, or you can't switch to another narrator and then sort of weave it together that way. So, but I enjoy that challenge. I like writing in first person.
Thank you. And Tara?
So I have actually not been able to write a book yet with just one point of view. So the Mother Next Door is pretty much 2 points of view. It's Kendra and Teresa, and then there's another third point of view that's sort of anonymous. You don't know who's telling this part. And then in the current manuscript I'm writing right now, I have 5 points of view. I don't know what is wrong with me, but that's yes, 5, and they're all first person right now, which is insane.
Oh my God, I can't wait to read it.
Yes, but I totally agree with you. The limitations of first person it's hard, but it's also, I think, I don't know, for me, it's easier to get into the character and make the story more suspenseful if I'm telling it from a first person point of view, which is why all of them have been. And I actually started The Mother Next Door in third person, and my editor and I were like, this is not working. It's just not, it doesn't feel like as creepy and didn't feel as much at stake as if you're hearing this person talk. So I think that's why I'm drawn to first person. I don't know what's going to happen with my 5-person one, but fingers crossed it works out. We'll see.
I tried present tense, and that lasted for like a chapter, and I just couldn't do it.
I love present tense.
I do too, but I can't do it.
I love it.
Yeah. Present tense is I think
this is a huge debate, by the way. There's like lots of readers who hate present tense and all that
yeah,
stuff.
I love it, but I just it didn't work. I don't know. I kept getting my verbs mixed up.
It's so interesting. It's funny because right now the follow-up to Savage Kind, part of it isn't, not all of it. One of the perspectives is in present tense.
Really? Was it hard to write?
It is. I keep on messing up.
Yeah.
Especially because I keep on going back and forth between the two. But Savage Kind is first person as well. It's also diary entries, which is a different kind of first person. Because diary entries, the perspectives writing them don't have as long to reflect on what's been going on. They do have some space to reflect, but they're written pretty recently after the events that they're communicating, which presents kind of an interesting challenge because with time, with some space, if I was writing a first-person story now about, when I was 8 or something, there'd be a lot of time for me to reflect on that. And with, it's not as much time for these high schoolers to reflect on their, which makes for a sort of intimacy and immediacy, but it's also, it was a challenge to write. Originally, Savage Kind did not start. It started third person as well. And I quickly, well, not so quickly, unfortunately, figured out that was wrong. I wish I had been more. I could have seen to what it needed to be.
What did it change for you then when you moved it to first person?
When did it change?
What did it change?
Oh, well, it changed. I added a perspective. First of all, I originally had written it in purely Philippa's perspective, third person. So, and then I changed it to Philippa's perspective, first person, and then I added Judy's perspective. And then I added a sort of mysterious frame narrator, which does have some distance, and that's where I get some of that distance around it. But, I love playing with point of view. I think it's really exciting because you just get different stuff every time,
Yeah.
And I know first person is very popular because it's so intimate, but it does have that. That's why it's almost like just doing first person one character is hard because you need some contrasting points of view.
Right. Yeah.
But it's fun to write. You get in the voice faster, I think.
I think so too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go. I have my list of questions here, but I just want to follow up on something. You guys are all talking about writing through time and how that affects the story, and I just wonder if maybe you could pick up on that and expand. And maybe this time we'll start with you, John.
Sure. So I think whenever you're thinking, approaching a character, you're not only thinking about what's gone on in the life of the character, but the teller of the story and how close they are to the events that they're telling in time. So that's where present tense, first person present tense is like happening right now. There's almost no room for reflection.
Yeah.
You actually have to build in action, pause in action to have them stop and reflect, because otherwise you can't just sort of insert it. Whereas, past tense, you can do that a little bit better. And then, just the years, the difference between, in Dodging and Burning, I have 2 women in their late 70s, 80s sharing their narration and looking back. And they have so much more room to sort of consider what has passed, from, they're doing this in 2000 or so, and they're looking back in the 1940s. And there's just so much more room to sort of reflect. And it's much more mature reflection, right? Because they've had all the sort of breadth of experience to kind of think about it. And there's things they haven't discovered too, which is interesting, but it's very different from, you're looking at 17-year-olds thinking about what happened yesterday. And they're not always going to get it right. So, and then I added a layer in Savage Kind where I have a frame narrator who has sort of pieced together these journal entries. And she is one of the a grown-up version of one of the two girls. She just refuses to tell you which one. And so she doesn't want you to interpret the narrative based on one or the other young women. But beware. Because, and whenever you're piecing together pieces of the past, you're also maybe messing with what they construe. So.
Donna Andrews, who is also a mystery author, a Virginia mystery author, who's probably well known to everybody here and is in the same critique group, told me a long time ago that one of the things that she does, and it works really well for her, is she keeps the time span of her books short. And when you're writing the kind of mystery I write, that allows for things to get lost. That allows for the lab was closed, so they couldn't get the DNA. I mean, it gives you a lot of things can go wrong and that can't be. There's not enough time to fix them. And so I've always found that to be sort of a good framework for me, as my books sort of take a weekish, maybe 10 days or whatever. And one of the things that I've had to do for that is, as a result, I have to know sort of, is it morning, noon, night, like what time of day? And so I have this, this spreadsheet for each. I write in scenes. I took a film, like a course about filmmaking in London many years ago, and that's movies are just all about scenes. So ever since then, I've thought in scenes, and then I have to know, is it morning, is it afternoon, and then how that all fits together. And that comes in really handy when a year later, when I'm on my next book, the copy editor comes back and says, wasn't it already Monday? I mean, is it Monday again? And then I have to go back and look at my scene. And the only time I got caught up was a book where, if I change what I write, if I write something and it doesn't conform to my little spreadsheet, I go back and fix the spreadsheet, because that's not what is driving the book. The narrative drive is driving the book, and I forgot to change it. And so she said, the copy editor, I was with Scrivener then, she said, it's Memorial Day weekend, the courts aren't open. And I said, they made an exception. I mean, what are you going to do? Really, really late in the game. There's no way to change the book. It's already been typeset. It's like, and you have to fit it into a sentence, So it's, at my peril to not sort of keep track of what's happening when.
Yeah, I actually have a hard time with that too. And when I'd written the draft of The Mother Next Door, I went back and I kind of plot, because it takes place like the month leading up to Halloween, so it's like 30 days or something. And I realized I had like 12 Thursdays in the month. I was like, what? How's it Thursday again? So I had to actually take the calendar and be like, okay, what is happening when? And it helped. And there's like this full moon ceremony in there, and I'm like, well, when would the full moon be in relation?
Yeah.
It was. So it's kind of funny to try to plot all that stuff out, because you don't want to worry about that necessarily in like the first draft stages, because you just want to get it all out and you got to be creative and all that. But then there comes a time when you're like, okay, does this make any sense at all? Then the book that I'm writing now, it's really short time, like 3 days. Wow. So I think the multiple points of view will actually help in that case, because we're switching. If it was one person for 3 days, they'd have to do so many mundane things. But if you're switching up people's points of view, you're getting other thoughts and you're getting, new things happening. So I'm hoping that will help a little bit with that short time frame.
So I think a lot of writers dream of leaving the office and the spreadsheets along with them, but it sounds like those are just a part of life now.
Right.
Yeah. Darn. Okay. So let's get back to the characters. I think that you guys all created these just really interesting cast of just textured and layered characters, particularly the female characters, but in varying degrees. The people your novels aren't always likable, and especially the females aren't always likable. Were those difficult to sell to publishers, and did you get any pushback on that? And I think we started with John. Maybe Tara, let's start with you again.
No, I didn't. In fact, my editor was more like, make them more unlikable.
We're extremely unlikable.
Just go away, like. So, because I actually have a tendency to want to make all of my characters, like, I just, I kind of love them. I don't want bad things to happen to them. So I have to try to make bad things happen to them. And I apparently have to make them more evil, right? They need more secrets. They need more things. So so no, I did not get that pushback. I don't read a ton of reader reviews, but I have seen people say like, oh, I hated all of these women, but I still like the book. It wasn't like I hated all these women, so I am not reading this, but which is good because sometimes you get that too. So I think that there is a growing fondness in readers for unlikable characters, especially if they are complex, right? They're not just these like stereotypical cardboard bad people. And if you can kind of understand where their motives are coming from and why they're doing what they're doing, then I think you can do that well. I love unlikable characters. So.
And then we'll go maybe to John.
I agree. I mean, I think that, I actually find likable characters really dull to read. I mean, of course, in my life, I would like to hang out with likable people. But in my reading, I would rather hang out with unlikable characters that have layers and complexities to them that fully humanize them. And I think that's the aim, is to make someone do things that you would not agree with morally or otherwise, but understand maybe why a little bit they're doing them, and maybe even be a little bit on their side, even that seems kind of like a transgressive thing. I think it's an interesting thing to do. I think expands our compassion in an interesting way, to read richly drawn unlikable characters. So I didn't get any pushback at all. I mean, I think that people and readers are sort of changing a little bit. I think there's also a thing going on in my novel with this social, what's likable in 1950 and 1948, maybe not so much what's likable now. And I think that the values have shifted, and so I have these more progressive young women trying to be independent in a time period that wasn't really supporting that. I think they were certainly not likable particularly Judy in her particular, setting. But so playing around with that. But now I think we would see some of the things that they do as young women as sort of at times misguided, even a little devious, but understandable considering what they're up against. So playing around with that a little bit was interesting.
When I started writing this series, I was living in England, and I really wanted this story to have some kind of a foreign setting. So I started the first book, Lucy's in France, and then she came back to the United States, and so I made her mother French, and moved to Virginia. So I thought, well, why would she be in France? And originally it was, if she's a student, she's going to be too young to go back and run the vineyard. So I needed a reason, and I thought, she's recovering from a car accident. So I sent her over. So that's why she's there. She has been in a very bad accident, and it left her with walking with a limp. She needs to use a cane. She has a disability, and she's, she used to be a runner in school, and she's lost all of that now. So when she comes back, her disability is. It's not a flaw, and I don't even think it's a flaw, but it's the thing that she has to overcome, or she has to work with, and how I could make that happen. And I did get some pushback actually from a few readers, and then the most interesting pushback I got was from when I was in the early days of the series, Juanita Swedenborg, which is where the vineyard, Lucy's Vineyard, was based on Swedenborg Estate Vineyard in Middleburg, which no longer exists. Juanita passed away in 2007, but Juanita was in her 80s. She grew up in the Dust Bowl in Kansas, sorry. And she didn't like Lucy being disabled, and she'd say, like, well, can't you just heal her between books, And I was like, no, I can't. And in fact, I ended up in one of my newsletters, I said, well, what if she had surgery? And a lot of people wrote back and said, please don't make her perfect. She's like me. I don't get to read too many people like me, and I don't want her to be perfect. Yep. And then the other thing, finally, my husband said to me, when we lived in Russia, Andre contracted something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Has anybody heard of it? Yeah. Well, you don't want to be in the Soviet Union in 1990 with Guillain-Barré syndrome. They medevaced him to Germany and then took him to Walter Reed for 6 months. It is a cousin of MS. It is rare but reversible paralysis. And in Andre's case, it was so bad that they flew him in a body bag on a military transport from Germany to Andrews and took him by ambulance to Walter Reed. And he was with a doctor who could open his chest in case he stopped breathing, because if Guillain-Barré attacks your lungs, it's fatal if you're not in a hospital where they can put you on a ventilator. So he walks with a limp. And finally he said to me, "Don't you think it's about time you tell people part of the reason you're writing this?" Mm-hmm. So I said, "But, I never wanted it, I never wanted to make it your story." And he said, I'm okay with that. And we also have a son who has autism. So writing about a person with a disability has been sort of really important to me.
Okay, so I am looking at time here, and I want to make sure we have time to get through these questions and also talk to the audience a little bit. So I'm going to compress some of these. I'd like to know, for your characters, and we're talking about pressure and what is motivating them, can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between ambition and envy for your characters? And I think, maybe John, let's start with you this time.
Sure. Yeah, so I think... sometimes I think they get a little muddled in certainly my characters' minds. There is sort of envy. First of all, Judy and Philippa both really are attracted to things that they see in one another that they don't have. In Judy's case, it's sort of stability in a family that Philippa does have. Judy has a family, but that's a whole part of the story. And it's not great. It's not a warm family. And I think what Philippa sees in Judy is that sort of, absolute sort of self-possession and, willingness to sort of just be who she is, no matter what people care about. And so I think that becomes both their ambition and somewhat their envy. I think they both want those things to a certain degree. They see in each other. They want them for themselves. So it's also, I think, also admiration. I think it's all bound up in attraction too. So, and then I think the third sort of person in my story is Miss Martins, their teacher, who they kind of hold up on a pedestal. And they see her as who, they envy her a little bit because that's who they want to be. They want to have her sort of presence and power. And so I think that's something they kind of bond together over. But so I think I think it's always kind of confusing, like flow of emotions. That makes it fascinating. So.
Ellen, do you
I'm not sure that's so relevant for my books. I think, that, I don't know.
I definitely think it's relevant, but I could also see where maybe you want to let that unfold for the reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To me, the sort of the overarching motivation for Lucy in any of this is when you have an amateur sleuth and you keep going through as many books as you do, I decided that how am I going to do this? I'm not going to make her smarter than the police. I'm not going to make her nosy. She has to be likable. So what motivates Lucy in everything she does is she has a strong love of family. And so the reason for her to get involved in anything, the hook that I have to find is something's going to happen to someone she loves, and that's kind of what drives her. So I think it's a little bit different for me.
Okay, thank you.
So for me, I think first of all, I think ambition and envy are so wrapped up in one another, and as a motive for a character, I think. If I'm thinking about these two things, though, like my 2 points of view, my 2 characters, Kendra and Teresa, I would say Teresa's probably the envy and Kendra's the ambition, but they both also embody both of those things. But Teresa definitely wants something that she feels like she did not have in her life. She wants to live in this perfect neighborhood. She wants to be the popular girl for once. And Kendra is the mom who leads everything. She's the one that plans all the events, and she plans them the way she wants to plan them. And she's the control freak. And so the two of them share these characteristics too. So I'm not sure you can pull one, from the other because they're so wrapped up in one another. But both of those are definitely themes that I was playing with when I was writing this.
So closely related to this ambition and envy, there are very strong, idealized women at the center of these novels. And certainly that's true for Ellen, your novel, with Jackie Kennedy being really the central. So maybe we'll start with you in this one. Can you tell us, like, what made you decide to center on her, and maybe kind of what are the ramifications of the idealization of these women on the plot?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I forget, I was writing something. I'm actually 2 books ahead of this book now. This Bitter Roots is done, and I'm writing another book, so it's like I had to think way back. But I'm the generation that, the Camelot and the Kennedys and everything else was a big deal for me. And then I ended up talking to my daughter-in-law, and I said, "What do you think of Jackie?" And she goes, "I don't." Which was really interesting. Like, how could you not? But it is a sort of a generational thing, and I think, but it's. I mean, there was this sort of whole, for my generation, there was this whole magic about the Kennedys and Jackie. She was 29 when she was First Lady. Can you even imagine? Yeah, I did not know that. I mean, I always thought Michelle Obama was I didn't think Michelle Obama was the youngest, but she was quite amazing, and she's the one who founded the White House Historical Society. She's the one who brought the White House, renovated the White House. She had so much grace and charm, and there was this mystique about her. And she used to come out to Middleburg, and she came out there because she nobody went gaga over her. Nobody reported. Nobody just snapped a picture of her and put it on Instagram. And in fact, she was in Middleburg when she fell off her horse, and they took her to the hospital, and that's when they discovered that she had the cancer. So they brought her back to New York, and where she passed away 6 months later. And in the middle of all of that, in 1994, my family was moving to London, but my mother-in-law knew Jackie, because when Jackie used to come to New York to look at the French couturiers came to town, my mother-in-law went along as her translator, and they stayed friends. So I remembered when we got to London, the day our furniture arrived, a few days before that, my mother-in-law had written a letter, and she said, "I'm so worried about Jackie. I haven't heard about her. I wonder what's going on." And she said, "I think I'll call John." She still called him John Kennedy Jr. But that day when we were moving in, we had these big burly moving guys moving us in, blokes, and it was the day she passed away, and it ended up it was like the top story on the BBC News. And all the men who were moving us in stopped and got into the cab of the truck, and they were just about in tears. And I thought, wow, she really is an international icon.
Thank you. Tara?
What was your?
Oh, I'm sorry.
We were wrapped up
I
in
answered something
Jackie
totally
story.
different.
Yes, I love her. She is an international.
Yeah.
I answered something totally different.
It was about the role idealized women, or maybe for you, the idealization of women.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I mean, in my book, I think the women sort of idealize one another in some way. The community that they have created, it's very insular, and also like they're both very selective as to who they're friends with, but then they also want to make sure everybody else knows how awesome they are. One of the things that we talked about before the panel with Leah was the role of the men in the story. And for my book, like, the men are largely absent. In fact, I think that's one of the lines in one of the point of views, like, the men who are not really relevant to this story. And I think that was like a deliberate choice for me, just because I feel like a lot of times in these communities and in the schools, it's really the moms who sort of rule all the decision making and stuff. And that's not to say that the men aren't interested in that. It's just, it's almost like I don't know why that is, but I've noticed that, especially like in like the suburbs of Virginia. So I wanted to kind of play with that a little bit and see what happens when all of that competition and all of that I want to be in chargeness collides, and what happens with those pressures. So.
And then John.
Yeah, sure. It's true. I've taught in Nova, so I know that I'm
Right near both of us.
Yeah. My character Miss Martins is idealized to these two young girls, and I think a certain degree they need to see their idol fall or change or become tarnished for them to grow up. Like, it's part of their rite of passage to realize that there is no such thing as a perfect adult. It's starting to realize your heroes are flawed. They then give them some space to become their own heroes or their own, in charge of their own lives. And so I think that plays a big role in this story.
Thank you so much. Now, with just about 10 minutes left, I would love to see if there's any questions in the audience. So I know we have like a small group here. I'd love you guys to just think of it like a little book club. And please, if you have something brewing, just let me know. In the back.
It seems to me like all three of your books have a certain element of like the recreation of social or cultural norms, whether that's putting women back into their place after the war, or a family culture of keeping this secret about the affair. And so I wonder if you can kind of expound on that and how that plays into your plotting.
Just for the people at home, he was asking about the creation of norms and putting people back in their place.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly that's true in my story. We are dealing with after the Second World War, where a lot of those norms sort of for good reason, because of the war and everything's changed, and it seemed like a time of opportunity for women, and I think that the 50s, that we have the men coming home from war, and it's sort of the reaction back against that. And I think you also have, and I deal with this more in the second book, but you have the treatment of LGBTQ people during this time period, which is terrible in the 1950s with the Lavender Scare in D.C., the McCarthy era, and all that, which I will talk more about in my other book. But, it's that I'm really interested in the way the characters continue to try to carve out a space for themselves, even when the norms come in and kind of keep them from, or try to keep them from being themselves.
John, I also think in your book there's a generational divide too. Like the older women want to see, put the younger women in their place, or
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The older female characters seize their power in ways and use them, but it's not necessarily
like they've worked the system and they don't want to see that system.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah,
Which I think is also at play a little bit in what what I was talking about with my book. Like these are really strong, independent women, and they have careers and they're powerful, but yet it seems like when they get into these school situations and these like tiny little power struggles, like they almost revert back to these traditional roles of like, the women do the school things, the women do the bake sale. Like there's no men at the PTA bake sale in this. And maybe there are I'm sure there are places in which this is not true. But when my husband and I lived in a townhouse community in Northern Virginia, we actually there were a lot of families in the townhouses where the dads were stay at home, raising the kids, and it was much more, I think, diverse in those roles. And then when we moved to our new community, which is kind of a little bit what I based the book on, don't tell my neighbors. It was so much more traditional. And my husband, who really raised our son, because I had the full-time job, he was teaching, so he was really the kind of the stay-at-home dad almost. He was the outlier. He would take Dash to the Gymboree classes and be the only guy there, and it was all the women who took the kids to the bus stop in the morning and that sort of thing. So I just find it interesting how that happens. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think Lucy's a little bit iconoclastic, actually, because when I started writing this series, and it's been like 20 years, more, there weren't that many female winemakers, and she's also a woman with a disability. So, but there are more now, and I've talked to several of them, and I've spent a lot of time talking to Kiernan Slater, who is her family owns Slater Run. And I said, what's it like for you? And she said, we we don't have to try any harder. We're respected, the way the men are. There's not this whole gender, thing or primacy of a male winemaker. But she said, no, I feel pretty good. And it was sort of interesting. But when I started, there were very few women.
We had another question in the audience.
Ellen, because you're writing this series, how did you get from number 11 to number 12? And you've got Jackie Kennedy in 1, and now how do you shut that up? How do you move your character forward from there into the next story?
For the longest time, for like the past probably 10 years, Lucy's been engaged to her winemaker. So it's like everybody kept saying like, when is the wedding? So, but I thought, I am not writing the wedding book. I am not writing the wedding book. And I didn't. And I ended up writing, this was a story about ambition and also the other thing that's become more and more, once I stopped writing about like particular types of grape or whatever like that, I knew that trope was only going to go so far, and which is why I took a hiatus after writing 6 books. But climate change is a really, really, really big deal everywhere, and in the wine world as well, and how much it's impacted. It's impacting all of us. So kind of my, sort of the leitmotif ended up being climate change and a wedding.
Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for maybe one more question. I do have another question, though, and we have 5 minutes left, and I was a little worried I wouldn't get to ask this. You guys all keep on kind of alluding to what's next, so I just would love to end with each of you telling us what's next for you. Maybe we'll just go right down the line.
Sure. So I'm working on Savage Kind as a concept is the first of 3 books, a trilogy. The second one's set in 1958. I think it even had a title, Hall of Mirrors, and I've been working on that. It deals a lot with these girls as they confront McCarthyism and systemic racism in D.C. during that time period.
Oh, I've got a lot going on. So Bitter Roots officially comes out in America on April 5th, and I'll be doing a book tour. And this is sort of the first time anybody's seen this book, So, and they have...
It's a premiere here.
It is premiering here, and Michael has copies, so go for it. And so I'll be touring for that virtually, and a couple of virtual tours, but I'll be out and about in Northern Virginia, and it's on my website if you want to take a look there. But in the middle of all of this, when I finished Bitter Roots, my editor said to me, "We're going to write another book, another wine book." And I said, "You know what? I did 6 and I took a break. I did 6 more and I took a break. Or I did 6 more now, and I need to take a break. I need some time off." And there's a lot going on in my personal life at the moment. My family, my husband's not well. So she said, "Well, what do you want to do next?" And so I talked to my agent, and I had written these 2 books about this photojournalist. It was much more the life that I knew, journalism and international journalism. So I knew that I could go back and sort of pick up that thread more easily than if I did a standalone, which I eventually want to do someday. So I said I'd like to write another book with Sophie Medina, with the photojournalist, and they said, "Okay, do it," and which was wonderful. And then my agent went and got the rights back for the first 2 books, Multiple Exposure and Ghost Image, from Simon & Schuster, and turned around and sold them to my new publisher, who turned around and reissued them with new covers. So those 2 books are out now. So you can find the first 2 books of the Sophie Medina series out just since February. And the 3rd book will come out next year in 2023. It keeps changing titles, but at the moment it's called Blow Up.
I do want to just tell people here and at home that even though it is a part of the series, I didn't realize that when I read it. And the French Paradox you can read it as a standalone, as an introduction too, and then go back and read the series. So don't feel like you have to just. You didn't read the series, you can't do this.
Well, the first one came out in 2005, so it's been a day or 2. Yeah. Thank you, Leah.
Yeah. Okay, Tara.
I've already kind of discussed the mess that is my current manuscript. So that is what I'm doing right now, and if all goes well, it's due in September and should be out in 2023. So we'll see. But it is another just domestic suspense, and there will be secrets and creepy people. So
September. What's your due date?
What's that?
What's your due date?
Sometime in September.
Oh, mine's the 1st. We'll have to go back.
don't
We'll have to
know.
help each other out when we get to
I
the.
probably won't make that, but
Oh.
tell my editor.
The 5 narrators, I don't understand why. Seems easy. I just want to thank everyone for joining us in the audience, and I want to thank all the authors for being here with us today.
Thank you, Leah.
Leah was a great moderator.
Thank you. I do want to remind you all that there are books for sale in the back, and the authors will be available for signing. So if you have some questions or comments that you did not want to ask, please beat them in the back, but let them get back there before you try. Don't rush them on the stage. Give them a sec to get back there. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.